Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Winback, and on today's episode of RPG Radio, we're going to be playing Armored Core 6 because I have got a new lightweight build that is surprisingly fun. I'm not typically a lightweight player. I'll give it anything from medium and above usually, but this one, it just tickled me in all the right ways. You can check back on this channel all the way back to the HOTS days, but normally you're going to see the big, beefy guys and all the builds that go with them. The interesting thing about having a big health bar, at least in my perspective, is that when you get hit, you can just keep on going. Being able to shrug off damage and still cause lots of problems for the bad guys is a great feeling. So, in contrast to that, this build is much more mobile and does a lot more damage. It just happens to go about things in a much more strange spectrum. That being said, there are a couple different parts of this build that are integral in making it work, and by now you may have noticed a couple different things going on for yourself. So, let's take a look at what I consider the signature piece of this build, the laser orbit. These weapons are going to be shoulder-mounted weapons, and we're taking 2 for the maximum damage output possible. If you've ever seen an episode of Gundam, or to be honest, any mech show within the last 15 years, you're probably familiar with the concept of funnels. Funnels are basically little orbiting machines that will follow around the mech and fire lasers or missiles or any number of different types of weaponry at enemies. They are a lot less flashy in Armored Core because they sit pretty close to you, but that being said, they do perform the same function. They have their own targeting, they can shoot independently of what you are aiming at, and in a lot of circumstances, they are very good at clearing out trash that is just too much energy to focus on. That being said, they are energy weapons, and you can turn them off and on. They're basically toggleable weapons until they overheat. So, when you're using the laser orbit, you'll hit your shoulder button to activate them, they'll begin floating, and they'll begin targeting different enemies in the vicinity. If you've got a whole bunch of small enemies all over the place, they're very good at picking people off and cleaning up what you're not aiming at or what you are aiming at. If you're in a single target battle, these little guys can do an absolutely devastating amount of damage and melt things, just like Sula is figuring out here, as he is in basically our perfect range of attack. Now, these weapons are fairly unique in Armored Core 6, as there are only really 2 if we're not counting the deployable turret measure as a third. One of them is an energy weapon, which we're using right now, the laser orbit, and another is not. That is going to be full bullets and much more impact damage, but also a little bit more interesting to use because they are burst fire, and I want to say that they're a little bit less accurate, but that's a question for another video. As far as the rest of the weapons go for this build, there is the 66LH laser handgun and the 770LB laser blade. The laser orbits obviously fit the laser theme as well, so why not go with the other energy weapons that make me feel nice and cozy. There is a reason we opted for these 2 weapons as well, but that will be more apparent when we get to talking about the generator. Suffice it to say, they are very light, but they can do a lot of damage, and they are very much a carry weapon of their own. We don't have to rely solely on the laser orbit to deal damage in this build, because the laser blade and the laser handgun can actually put out a decent chunk of it if you are backed into a corner. In all fairness, when it comes to energy-based melee weapons in this game, there really is very little bad to say about them, especially when they are a big energy pulse coming off of a boss that takes half your health because you didn't back up in time. You may have noticed I'm a little bit surprised about how much damage this build is dealing, because Balteus doesn't typically take half his health bar in the first 10 seconds. Which is something that I noticed for a lot of people playing lighter builds. You have to take bigger weapons at least in the damage department, to seal things quickly, because ultimately you can only dodge for so long. If you're doing big damage in smaller amounts of time, the boss or the enemy or the player that you're playing against is going to be dead quicker. So, really, it just is not the kind of playstyle I love. I do like dealing big damage, but I also like having some balance to the way that things work. That being said, this build, the laser orbit, the laser weapons of it all, have to have their windows, and they have to have a specific range to make all of that stuff work, which is the medium range. And in order for Balteus to take any damage from our laser orbits, he actually has to have his pulse shield down completely, meaning that we have to use the laser blade and the laser handgun to tear that down before we can really start melting him with the orbits. It's a good idea to have them out when his shield is down, but when the shield is up, the amount of damage that they're doing to it really is just, it's hard to see. And wasting ammo on them isn't a great idea, and if you have them out entirely while he's got his shield up, like right now, saving his life in the absolute 11th hour of this first attempt, it can be a little bit tough to wear through. The laser orbit only really does significant damage when the enemy isn't shielded. Now, it may just be that Balteus has a bigger pulse shield than normal, but from what I can tell, unless you are pulse shield less, the laser orbits do not do a significant amount of damage in taking that down. And honestly, that brings me to the tangent of Balteus as a very good test for any build. Ultimately, this mission will be the make or break for anything that you want to play in Armored Core, especially after your first playthrough. This mission is actually very diverse in what you can accomplish with an AC or with any build that you're coming into the game with, because there are plenty of different enemy types, from MTs to the big static tanky turrets that deal tons of damage but will not stand up to any sort of pressure. You've got your AC mini boss fight in Sula, because he is all mobility, he's got repair kits, and he's got a pretty good chunk of damage. And then there's Balteus, the big boss at the end, who's got a lot of very recognizable patterns, but is still pretty difficult to deal with depending on your build. So, as it is, I can always recommend this mission, the Attack the Watchpoint mission, and Balteus as a boss, since there is so much diversity in this mission without being overly easy and kind of poisoning your idea of how your build performs. But that's another tangent wrapped up, and it is just in time to show you how important the assault armor really is when it comes to boss fights, AC fights, and just nailing a stagger at the perfect moment. I think one of the things that I've noticed that really separates my early game Armored Core 6 player mentality from my endgame experience is the use of things like the assault armor, the assault boost kick, and other mechanics going on in these builds that aren't readily available. Armored Core is all about what you've built and how you are going to take it into the mission, the battle, the PvP arena, and what you can do with it, knowing that your build is what you've made it. In classic FromSoft fashion, the game is all about the player having the agency to make their own decisions, but also putting all of the onus to succeed on the player as well. That being said, though, we do have a number of other parts to talk about in this build, so rather than watch me fly around listlessly in the ECM fog, we're going to take a look at those parts and then come back to more drone destruction and a very big angry helicopter that didn't get his fair shot in the tutorial fight. So when we're talking about body parts, it's easy to start with the top, and that's the head. The Firmeza head and the Firmeza core are both lightweight parts. The head, really not a whole lot to talk about. I mean, it is on the lighter side as far as AP goes, so you're losing a good chunk of health by not taking the heavier heads, but the scan duration is pretty long. I don't think that's going to sell anybody on a head, but it looks really cool, and it works especially well, at least aesthetically, with the Firmeza core. The core does suffer from a lot of the same issues that the head does, but it's a lightweight core. It's going to have low AP. It does actually have lower than some of the other lighter cores in AP as well. It's pretty far down there with only 2,500. So that being said, being that it's so light, it's going to make up a lot of that fault, in that you should be able to use a bit more weight in the rest of your build because the core isn't taking up tons of that weight allotment. And the last two body parts to talk about are going to be our arms, the Noctrier arms and the VP422 legs. The arms are actually more important than the legs, if you can imagine that, even though the legs are all about supporting the weight of your AC while keeping it light. There's not really much you need in the way of understanding when it comes to standard bipedal legs, even on the lightest frames. The Noctrier arms, though, are going to have a pretty important effect on this build, and that is because they have the highest firearm specialization out of all the arms at 160. What that means is that when you are using these arms in a build, your AC is going to track the target and hit much more frequently because that firearm specialization is so high. Now that is only going to affect weapons that you are using with those arms, but ultimately, remember when you're playing this particular AC, you have one weapon in your right hand that is going to benefit very greatly from higher firearm specialization. The fact that these are light arms and that they go with the build is another really important factor of them, but ultimately they are going to help your offense a lot more because you'll be able to hit more consistent shots with the single weapon that you have outside of your shoulder-mounted orbits. The way everything is put together in this build, ultimately all of your weapons can do very, very consistent levels of damage because each of them rely on different aspects of the build. Meaning your handgun works off your arms incredibly well, your laser blade also works off of your boosters relatively well. The boosters have pretty average melee adjustment. Your whole frame is very light, so you'll also be able to rock a whole lot of use out of your generator capacity and the amount of quick boosting and assault boosting that you can do. On top of that, your damage from your funnels, your orbits as they were, is really easy to pull off. Once you can get them in range to work, they do all of the aiming on their own, and if they are considered focusing at a single target, they're just going to light that sucker up even more than normal. Couple that with the ease of aiming with your handgun, and everything just kind of falls into place. Not to mention, you can look incredibly flashy when it comes to using lightweight ACs, lots of quick boosting, lots of assault boosting, lots of just easy movement, and as long as you're not getting hit left and right, which, to be fair, is a lot harder to do when you're this mobile, you should be able to absolutely clobber some of the bigger, slower moving bosses and a lot of the smaller yet less mobile trash. The trash enemies like the MTs, even the tetrapods are going to have a lot of hard times keeping track of you to land those bigger hits. So playing a light AC, there's a reason that everybody does it, but when you're playing a light AC, the real decision that you're going to make when it comes to damage is, do I want to take one weapon that's going to do everything all at once and then play around that, or do I want to have a couple different weapons that maybe don't do damage in such big burst patterns and take my time, which is what we're doing with this build with the funnels, the laser blade, and the laser handgun. It is ultimately incredibly fun to play this way, but we have changed it a little bit to make sure that it fits outside of a more cheesy kind of norm. I don't really like playing Armored Core to run in, blitz something in one hit, and then be done with the mission. Unless, of course, we're talking about the pile bunker, and then everything goes out the door, because that's my favorite weapon of all time, and it is The best weapon in the game. No, I will not take any questions. There will be no discussion, no nothing to talk about there. The pile bunker wins. You're welcome. But let's not forget a couple of the other unsung heroes in this build that we have to talk about, namely our boosters and the biggest workhorse in the build, which is the generator, the Sentai. As the attack helicopter, the heavy attack helicopter, starts to breathe its final breath, we can pull those bad boys up, and I can tell you just how much they are going to affect your build, especially the generator that is equipped for heavy guys. Now, when I say heavy guys, I mean that this generator is, as far as the description goes, built for heavy machinery. So those heavy ACs, your big thick boys, are generally going to be able to make more use of the Sentai than the little guys, but that's usually because of weight problems. The good news about this build is that the Sentai gives you a massive energy reservoir and some pretty decent energy recharge, but it isn't going to weigh down the AC because a lot of the weaponry and pieces that we're using are very lightweight anyway. It also makes it so you're not exceeding your energy load, which isn't possible with a lot of the other generators. Some of them don't even output enough energy to equip these weapons, which is really sad because it just kind of locks you into this generator. Not to say it's a bad thing, because it really just does all the work for the build. So if you are deciding to play this type of build, or this build specifically, that generator is going to be basically mandatory. You can go with the coral generators. They are going to change the playstyle pretty drastically, because you're basically reliant on using all of the energy all the time, dumping that bar down to 0, and then letting it fill all the way back up with its supply recovery. So I tested the coral generators. I wasn't a big fan. They're really cool looking with their red booster effects, but I just couldn't wrap my head around getting down to 0 and then letting everything build back up, because I don't like to sit around with an empty energy bar. It's just, it's brain stuff for me when it comes to those generators. So, that being said, I know that they have a place, and they're probably sitting somewhere in a build in my head that I haven't really felt yet. But that is neither here nor there, as is plenty of other stuff in this video. The Sentai, just everything that you need in the form of a generator for this build. It's the best one. Enough said. Now, our last two parts are pretty unassuming. That's going to be our boosters, the G2PO4, and the FCS, the fire control system, the G2PO5. Pretty similar sounding names, if I'm being honest, and that's just fine because they're both very average, with the exception of the fire control system. The boosters are just across the board a B student. They do everything that you need, they do it all the time, they're never going to be bad at it, they're never going to be amazing at it, but with everything else going on in this build, they have low energy consumption, average weight, and a decent quick boost duration. They have decent quick boost stats, period. So they are going to be plenty good for what you need them to do. The fire control system, however, is going to be, it's just that piece of equipment that you look at and you're like, what even is this? What is this for? The fire control system is going to decide how well your AC aims at different ranges. This one in particular is going to be incredibly good at mid-range. Now, you can do close, you can do mid, and you can do long. There are fire control systems of varying degrees for all three of those, but this one, the PO5, actually has insanely high mid-range assist, meaning that when you are in the mid-range, not super close, but not super far away either, you're going to have some very, very strong targeting from your weapons on whichever target that you're locked onto. I don't think you need any more justification from me, but the funnels, the orbits on your back, as well as your laser handgun in this build operate incredibly well from middle range. That being said, when your funnels are able to just straight target and annihilate the enemy that you are focused on from that distance, you don't have to get very close until you want to for either your assault boost kicks or your big swinging laser blade charge. So it is incredibly good. I cannot sing the praises of the FCS anymore because it just makes hitting your shots with both your handgun and your funnels way easier. So if you need more proof than that they are pulling their weight, I guess you could go look up some more stats, but you could just take my word for it. Especially if you're just playing the build that I put in the video. I mean, you're welcome, I guess. That's really it for all the build pieces, though. I mean, there were a couple that are very important, like our generator, like our funnels, like our FCS. But a lot of the other pieces in this build are mainly for aesthetic purposes too. I knew I wanted a lightweight build, and that's what I went for. I wanted the most Gundam-esque build I could dream up, and I think I mostly got it. There's probably an argument to be made for a different aesthetic in body parts, and probably more of a medium weight build when it comes to, you know, being an actual Gundam, but that is for another video. We're destroying Leos left and right in the final mission of the video, and I don't need to tell anybody just how similar the LCs and the HC are to Gundam mobile suits. It's like you're fighting Leos when you're fighting LCs, and when you go fight the HC, it's like you're taking on a Taurus. It is so cool how much the designs remind me of those mobile suits from Gundam Wing, but maybe I'm just talking out of nowhere. Maybe those weren't even slightly involved in inspiration for these builds. Regardless, this mission in particular is a really good litmus test for lightweight ACs. I used this one instead of the corporate salvage, prevent corporate salvage of PCA equipment instead, because this one, well, it works a little bit differently. You aren't on a timer at the end of the day to kill one or the other sides of the mission before the other one shows up. It's a little bit more, you know, Mortal Kombat. One guy shows up, and then you move up the rung to take on the other guy with a whole bunch of smaller dudes in between. The HC is also a really messy enemy. And because of the shield that it had, the shield that it's always got up, because of the amount of melee that it can get off, the shield bash that it has to get you away when you are in melee range, the HC just has a lot of stuff going for it that some of the big weapons in the game really make short work of. But when you've got a lighter machine like this that has mostly energy weapons, the HC is really cool to fight. It is so fantastic. It's just a really cinematic boss. It looks cool, and you'll get your money's worth when it comes to dipping, diving, ducking, and dodging while trying to deal damage to the dude. I was gonna say something else there, but it's YouTube. Who knows what is real anymore? What's allowed? What are the guidelines? It's fine. Everything's fine. It's not like it was a hard fight. It's not like it was particularly mind-numbing. It is very fun, though. I will say any mission that involves a PCA craft is ultimately going to be a lot of fun to play. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch, I think. And with that cinematic flourish, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this video. Let me know down in the comments below if this fits your stereotype of a Gundam, or just fitting into the Gundam universe. I had an amazing time playing this build, and I would recommend it to anyone. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for hanging out. Tune in next time for another video. Peace out.